Which New York mobsters would feature on a hypothetical Mafia Mount Rushmore? Let's check it out. When sculptor Gutzon Borglum selected the 4 US presidents that would feature on his famous sculpture on Mount Rushmore, some sources state that he chose those specific presidents due to the historical impact that they had on the growth of the United States. So, bearing this in mind, if a hypothetical Mafia Mount Rushmore was to be constructed, which 4 mobsters would be included? My criteria for selection is based on the following. This will be a New York Mafia Mount Rushmore, so will only be mobsters from the 5 New York families. Therefore, there won't be the likes of Tony Accardo, Santo Trafficante, or Carlos Marcello included. Mobsters selected will have to have served as a boss in a mafia family. And the mobsters included will have to have had a significant impact on the history of organised crime. As a note, this is not an exercise of putting criminals up on a pedestal. It is simply listing influential mobsters from mafia history. First up, we are going to select Salvatore Lucchese, more famously known as Charlie Luciano. Charlie Luciano is often considered the father of the modern American Mafia. On his way to the top, he was involved to some extent with plotting to have mob bosses Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masseria murdered. Both these men had held the title of Boss of Bosses, so their killings in the space of a few months in 1931 is definitely historically significant in the history of the American Mafia. The murder of Joe Masseria signalled the end of the so-called Castellammarese War, and the murder of Salvatore Maranzano brought about the end of the era of the Boss of Bosses. Luciano is believed to have been one of the main architects behind the abolishment of the role of Boss of Bosses. It is often said that Charlie Luciano is credited with the invention of the Commission, a governing body in organised crime made up of several bosses, a committee that tried to keep the peace between crime families and resolve disputes. However, it can be argued that Luciano's role in this is greatly exaggerated, as there was already for many years general assemblies and a grand council of mob bosses that operated in much the same way as what we now call the Commission. However, Luciano could be seen as instrumental in the format of the modern Commission, with the abolishment of the role of Boss of Bosses. Luciano was the boss of what we now call the Genovese crime family. One observation that could be made is that during the period of when Luciano was in power on American soil, even during his 10-year spell in prison, there was relative stability in the New York underworld. It wasn't until after Luciano's deportation to Italy in 1946, and when his influence started to wane, that high-profile assassinations started to occur. In 1951, Willie Moretti, a high-level mobster in Luciano's crime family, was publicly murdered in New Jersey. Earlier that same year, Mafia boss Vincent Gigante and his brother Philip were both murdered, with Albert Anastasia taking over what is now called the Gambino crime family. In 1956, Albert Anastasia's underboss, Frank Scalise, was gunned down in the Bronx. In 1957, an attempt was made on the life of mob boss Frank Costello, the man who had succeeded Luciano as the boss of the family. And that same year, Albert Anastasia was famously shot to death in a barber's shop and eventually replaced by Carlo Gambino. All of these high-profile killings came when Luciano was in Italy. It could be a coincidence, but as mentioned, while Luciano was on American soil and in power from 1931, not a single mob boss was assassinated. Perhaps a demonstration of his influence in keeping the peace in the American Mafia. Next, let's quickly take a look at a mob boss who hasn't made the selection but could have been in with a shout. Joseph Bonanno became the boss of the crime family that still bears his name in 1931. He was only 26 years of age at the time. He led his family successfully for over 3 decades and became a prominent member of the commission. However, the wheels started to come off for Bonanno when he was allegedly involved in a failed plot to have rival mob bosses Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese murdered. In addition, following this, the commission decided to remove Bonanno as the boss of his family. Bonanno didn't acknowledge their decision, and in addition made the disastrous decision to make his inexperienced son Bill Bonanno the family consigliere, a move that angered many members of his crime family. This led to a split in the Bonanno family, leading to a civil war. By the mid to late 1960s, Joe Bonanno was considered persona non grata and retired to Arizona. Losing control of his family could be considered a major reason why Joe Bonanno has not made selection. The next mobster who I've selected for this hypothetical Mafia Mount Rushmore is another from the Genovese crime family. Mafia boss Vincent Gigante. Vincent Gigante was a mobster who straddled an older era of the mob in the 1950s and 1960s through to more modern times, where he passed away in prison in 2005. In his younger years, he had been close with Vito Genovese, and Gigante had been the triggerman in the failed attempt on family boss Frank Costello on Vito Genovese's orders, a historic event in New York mob history that eventually led to Frank Costello stepping down as boss to be succeeded by Vito Genovese. Forward just over 2 decades, and depending on the source that you read, Vincent Gigante became the boss of the Genovese family in around 1981. Some sources state that by using a front boss, Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, Gigante would manage to avoid being convicted in the historic commission case that saw the hierarchy of 3 of the other New York families convicted and sentenced to over 100 years in prison. In his latter years, Chin Gigante would famously be seen shuffling around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, mumbling to himself, an act to try and deceive the authorities into thinking that he was mentally ill. What is rarely discussed is that after a spell in prison for narcotics in the early 1960s, Vincent Gigante would regularly check himself into mental health care facilities, starting way back in 1970. A prolonged effort of nearly 30 years to build the appearance of a man with mental illness. With advances in technology and FBI surveillance techniques, Mafia boss Chin Gigante would order his men and those in other crime families to never utter his name openly. And as a result, mobsters would take to touching their chin when referring to him. Gigante would finally be convicted again in 1997 and died in prison in 2005. But it is his successful reign as a mafia boss for 2 decades in an era of more sophisticated surveillance techniques that earn him a place on the mountain. Next on the mountain is Carlo Gambino. Gambino ran the crime family that still bears his name from around late 1957, although initially on a provisional basis, until 1976 when he died a free man. His career dated back to the days of Prohibition in the 1920s. He was involved in the Castelmarese War, and after would rise up the ranks of the crime family that he was associated with, first under Vincent Mangano, and then under Albert Anastasia. In 1957, Albert Anastasia was gunned down. Mafia legend states that Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese were ultimately behind the famous Gangland hit. However, this is contradicted by FBI files that state that it was mobsters Joe Riccobono, Joseph Biondo, and Charles Dongara who made the decision to have Anastasia killed after they found out that Anastasia wanted them dead. Regardless, Anastasia's murder cleared the way for Carlo Gambino to become boss. Carlo Gambino is often seen as the classic Machiavellian mafia boss, and Gambino would allegedly paraphrase Machiavelli's theory about a man having to be a lion and a fox in order to be successful, a quote that has gone down in mafia lore. For the best part of 2 decades, Gambino ran one of the largest and successful crime families in New York. His impact transcended the mob itself. People with little interest in mafia history recognize his name. And when people discuss the type of elderly, unassuming mafia boss with great power and ruthlessness, they will picture Gambino. Before we take a look at my final selection for the hypothetical Mafia Mount Rushmore, let's look at a few more mafia bosses who had a significant impact on mafia history, for better or worse. John Gotti is perhaps the most famous name in modern mafia history. He orchestrated the murder of family boss Paul Castellano, arguably the most famous mob hit in history. He was the most public mob boss since Al Capone. His high visibility was perhaps his downfall, as it made him a prized target for the FBI. Carmine Persico was the boss of the Colombo crime family for several decades, albeit he spent the majority of his reign as boss in prison. His stubbornness to keep his power from behind bars led to a bloody civil war in his family that produced a spree of public killings in the street, a level of mob violence that had not been seen since the days of Prohibition. Joseph Profaci, a charter member of the Modern Commission, ran his family for over 30 years, before his alleged bad treatment of his men led to a civil war in his family with the infamous Gallo crew. This civil war left a stain on Profaci's legacy. In more recent times, Joseph Massino changed the fortunes of the Bonanno crime family after he became boss in 1991. The Bonanno family, that had been through a lot of turmoil, became one of the strongest families in New York, second to the Genovese. However, Joe Massino will always be remembered for becoming the first official mafia boss to become a government witness. And he even wore a wire to record conversations with his acting boss, Vincent "Vinny Gorgeous" Basciano. And so, to my final selection for this Mafia Mount Rushmore. In a somewhat left-field choice, I have selected Tommy Lucchese. Lucchese served as the underboss to secretive mafia boss Tommy Gagliano for 2 decades. When Lucchese finally became boss in the early 1950s, he made his relatively small family one of the strongest in New York. Tommy Lucchese liked to move behind the scenes. For example, he, along with Carlo Gambino, allegedly secretly supported the Gallo crew's rebellion against their family boss, Joe Profaci. Under his leadership, the Lucchese crime family was one of the most profitable and stable families in New York, with Lucchese being one of the pioneers in labor racketeering. One informant in the early 1960s told the FBI that Tommy Lucchese was the most powerful boss on the commission. His daughter Frances married Tommy Gambino, the son of mob boss Carlo Gambino, a union that cemented both families' power. Tommy Lucchese passed away a free man in 1967 of natural causes. There is, of course, no right or wrong answer to the question of who would feature on a hypothetical Mafia Mount Rushmore, and I have no doubt forgotten some other viable candidates. In the comments below, let me know the 4 New York mob bosses that you would select. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.